I moved into the cabin just before sunset, and the first thing I noticed wasn't the quiet but the way the air felt heavier out here, like it carried everything the trees had been keeping for years. The scent of damp cedar and wet moss sinking into my clothes before I even stepped inside, and I remember thinking that maybe this was exactly what I needed. A place away from the city, away from people, away from the constant noise that made my thoughts feel like static. The cabin was smaller than the pictures had suggested. One room with a narrow loft above, cedar walls faded gray from decades of rain, a metal roof that looked like it could sing when storms rolled through, and a porch whose railing leaned to one side like it had given up resisting gravity years ago. And as I carried my things inside, one duffel of clothes, a crate of canned food, a box of books I swore I wouldn't bring but couldn't leave behind, I kept telling myself this was going to work, that I could learn how to breathe out here, that solitude was going to save me somehow. I set my battered composition notebook on the small pine table next to the wood stove, its black and white cover creased and worn, and told myself I'd use it for something different this time, something real, that I'd write every day, and keep a diary, not for anyone else but for me, to prove that I was paying attention, that I could make sense of my life if I just slowed down long enough to put it on paper. The man who rented me this place, a guy named Granger, met me once in town and handed me the keys with a kind of relief that didn't make sense at the time, like he was passing off more than property, and he warned me that the cabin was old. The pump needed priming before the water ran clear. The propane stove could sputter if the pressure dropped. The mice would try to get in once the cold set in. And if I needed help, there was a volunteer station 10 miles down the mountain, Channel 9 on the little rescue radio. But he said not to call unless I really had to, because they'd remember, and then he just walked away without shaking my hand. Inside, the cabin smelled like cold wood and something faintly sweet, maybe pine resin baked into the walls over the years. And I stood there for a minute taking in the layout, the wood stove with its black belly waiting to breathe, the ladder leading up to a thin mattress in the loft, the single small window over the sink with a view into trees so dense they might as well have been a wall. And for a while, I just unpacked in silence, stacking books next to the bed, lining cans on the single shelf, checking that the lanterns worked in case the power failed. And when the sun dropped behind the tree line, the shadows swallowed the little clearing faster than I expected, blue turning to black in less than a minute, and suddenly the world outside the windows disappeared completely, like the cabin was a floating box in a void, and I felt my chest tighten before I laughed at myself, because this was exactly why I'd come here, to get used to quiet, to let my brain reset without sirens or neighbors shouting or late-night traffic bleeding through. Thin walls. I cooked a can of chili on the propane stove, sat at the table, ate while the wood stove clicked softly as the metal adjusted to the heat, and when I was done, I opened the notebook and wrote a first entry, something small, just enough to make it real. Day 1, arrived around 5, road worse than I remembered. No neighbors in sight, no service. Quiet feels like an animal in the room, watching me. I wrote about the deer I saw at the edge of the drive, about the way the air smelled cleaner than any air should, about the promise I made myself to stay here at least a month. And then I closed the notebook, placed the pen across it, and climbed the ladder into the loft where the mattress sagged, but the quilt smelled faintly of cedar and dust. And I lay there listening to the sound of the forest moving outside, branches shifting against each other like old secrets. And I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd finally done something right for myself. I don't know when I fell asleep, only that I woke up later to something I couldn't place at first. A voice, low and steady, speaking the exact words I'd written earlier. A man's voice reading my diary out loud like he was sitting at the table with the notebook open. And for a second, my brain tried to make it make sense, tried to convince me I'd left the rescue radio on. But the voice wasn't tinny or distant. It was warm, close, like someone standing at the foot of the loft. Ladder, and he read the words exactly as I'd written them, even the rhythm of my pauses, even the sentence I crossed out halfway and rewrote cleaner. And when he read both versions, my stomach dropped, because no one could have known I'd written the first one wrong unless they'd been in my head, and I froze, holding my breath until my chest burned, because there was no sound of the door opening, no footsteps on the porch, no window breaking, but somehow someone was reading my diary and my voice, but not my body. And I rolled slowly onto my side and looked down into the main room where the table sat exactly as I left it. The notebook closed beneath the pen. Nothing touched, nothing moved, and the voice kept going unhurried, patient, reading about the deer, about the quiet, about the promise to stay. And that was when I knew I had to move, had to confirm whether there was anyone outside, so I eased my legs down the ladder, each rung creaking louder than it should in the silence, and my feet touched the cool wood floor, and the voice was still there, not louder, not softer, just present, filling the air like mist. And I went to the table and laid my hand on the notebook, and it was warm from the room and solid under my palm. And I picked up the pen, the same cheap black pen I'd been using all day, and I held it like a weapon because in that moment it was all I had. And I told myself to open the door, to prove to myself that nobody was out there, to prove that I was being ridiculous. So I crossed the floor, unlatched the chain, twisted the deadbolt, pulled the door open slow enough to hear every hinge groan, and the cold air rushed in, sharp and metallic on my tongue, and the voice was outside now, drifting in from somewhere past the porch, the same steady cadence, like someone standing just beyond the tree line with a booklight, reciting my thoughts. To the dark, and I stepped out onto the porch and turned on my flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing, into the edge of the woods along the path I'd driven in on. And there was nothing. No footprints except mine. No figures. No movement except the slow sway of branches in the faint wind. And still the voice kept reading, slow and deliberate, not echoing but surrounding me like the night itself was carrying it. And I turned the light off just to test myself, to see if my ears were lying. But when the darkness swallowed me whole, the voice became clearer, closer, like it belonged to. The absence of light, and I couldn't stand it, couldn't let myself be part of whatever this was. So I stepped back inside, locked the door, pressed my back to it and waited, heart hammering hard enough to make the blood roar in my ears, and the voice reached the last line I'd written, about the quiet feeling alive. And then it stopped, clean, like someone closed a book in midair, and the silence that followed was louder than the voice had been. A silence so complete it felt like the cabin itself was holding its breath. I told myself I'd imagined it, that maybe the words had just been bouncing around in my head, but my hands were shaking as I climbed back to the loft, and I lay under the quilt staring at the dark window where faint stars cut thin patterns through the trees, and I made myself focus on my breathing, slow and steady. One inhale, one exhale, telling myself there was nothing out there, telling myself the quiet was safe, until something knocked on the door 3 times, slow, deliberate, perfectly measured, and I froze, every nerve locked. My breath caught in my throat as I waited for a 4th knock that never came. And in the silence after, the sound of my heartbeat felt louder than anything in the room. And I realized the worst part wasn't the knocks or the voice or even the dark. It was the thought that whoever was out there knew exactly what I'd written, exactly what I was thinking, and exactly how afraid I'd become. I didn't sleep much after the 3 knocks, just lay there listening for anything that might explain them. Some branch scraping loose in the wind, some raccoon pawing at the porch rail, something ordinary I could hang the fear on. But the night stayed painfully still. No wind, no animals, just the hollow sound of my own breath until I finally drifted off sometime after 4 and woke to the gray wash of morning seeping through the loft window, groggy and heavy like I'd been drinking, even though I hadn't touched a thing. I made coffee on the propane stove, sat at the small pine table, tried to convince myself daylight would make last night feel stupid. But when I went to open the door and step out onto the porch, my hand froze on the latch because right there, at eye level, carved deep into the cedar with something sharp, were 3 long vertical scratches, rough and splintered like someone had raked nails or a blade down the wood. And I backed up fast enough that the mug slipped from my hand and shattered across the floor, hot coffee splashing my bare feet. But I barely felt it because my brain was stuck on those marks, deliberate, too deep for an animal, too even for weather. 3 lines like someone wanted me to know they were here. I grabbed the flashlight and walked the perimeter of the cabin, heart hammering in my ears, and there were no footprints, no drag marks, no sign anyone had been near except those scratches, burned into the wood like a warning, I spent the day trying to shake it off, telling myself maybe they were old. Maybe I'd missed them yesterday, but every time I checked the door, the edges were clean. Pale, where the knife had cut through years of weather-darkened cedar. Fresh. Enough that splinters curled from the gouges and my chest stayed tight no matter what story I tried to tell myself. By afternoon, I decided to make the place harder to reach. Not because I believed someone would come back, but because I needed to feel like I was doing something. So I tied a length of fishing line waist-high around the porch steps, rigged it to an old brass bell I found in the shed, set up another just inside the tree line along the narrow path where the dirt was softest, and scattered a layer of dry leaves under the windows where anyone moving after dark would make noise. I also found an old hatchet under the bench by the stove, heavier than it looked, handle smooth from years of hands, and I kept it leaning against the wall by the door where I could reach it without looking. When the sun dropped, shadows pooling, like water around the base of the trees, I sat at the table with the rescue radio next to me, and the notebook closed. My hand on the cover, like keeping it shut might keep whatever was happening from happening again. But the hours passed quiet, the stove ticking softly as it cooled, and for a while I let myself believe it had been a one-time thing, some weird trick of the woods or my sleep-deprived brain. Until sometime after midnight when it began again. The voice. Not the same voice as last night. Higher this time. Softer. A woman's voice. Reading every word I'd written the night before, like she'd been waiting for me to sit down and listen, and my hand went cold where it rested on the notebook because the cover was still closed. The pen untouched, everything exactly where I left it, but her voice moved steady, calm, like she was perched on the railing outside under the heavy dark. And the worst part was that she didn't stumble once, not even over the sentence I crossed out twice, like she'd memorized not just the words but the mistakes. I shot a glance at the porch door, at the brass bell hanging from the fishing line, silent and still, and the cold punched through my chest because if she was close enough to read my words, she should have tripped it. But there it was, motionless, no sound, no warning, just her voice folding over my words like they belonged to her. And I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the window, switched it on, swept the beam in fast arcs across the clearing, down the drive, along the trees. But the forest stared, back empty, shadows holding their breath, and still she kept reading, never louder, never softer. Like the sound was inside the walls and not outside at all. I wanted to call out, to tell her to stop, but something in my gut told me not to give her that, not to let whoever or whatever it was know I could hear her. And so I just stood there in the dark with my heart pounding loud enough I worried she'd hear that instead. The reading went on for another 5 minutes, 10 maybe, until she reached the last line of my entry and stopped just as clean as the man's voice had the night before. No shuffle, no retreat, just absence. The kind of silence that makes you afraid to breathe. And I forced myself up the ladder, lay back on the mattress, hatchet clutched to my chest like I was 15 again, hiding from nightmares that didn't exist. Except this one did, and I stared at the ceiling until gray light finally pushed through the loft window again. The next morning, I checked the bells and the fishing line untouched, no sign anyone had been close, and I searched the clearing for footprints I knew wouldn't be there. And then I stood staring at the door until my throat went dry because, next to the 3 long scratches from yesterday, there were 3 more. Fresh, cleaner, cut so deep the pale wood beneath looked wet, and I stumbled back hard enough to hit the table, knocking the notebook onto the floor where it landed open, to a page I hadn't written yet, blank except for one line printed neatly in the center in handwriting that wasn't mine. Stop writing. I don't remember picking it up or putting it back on the table, just standing there with the cold sinking into my spine until the shadows shifted, and I realized the sun was already dropping behind the trees. I skipped dinner, skipped coffee, sat on the edge of the bed watching the door, hatchet across my lap. Lanterns lit. The notebook closed again, but burning on the table like it had its own pulse. And for hours nothing happened, just the low hum of the radio and the fire cracking, softly in the stove, until sometime after 1 a.m. when I felt it. Before I even heard it. The same pressure as last night. The cabin tightening around me. The air growing heavier. And then the voice returned. Not the man, not the woman. Something else now. Quieter, closer, almost behind my ear, speaking so low I couldn't make out the words, but knowing somehow they were mine. And I froze in place, lungs locked, every muscle screaming to move. And then I heard something worse than the voice, something wet and real and present. A slow inhale that wasn't mine coming from the corner of the room. And I turned the flashlight toward it, with a hand that didn't feel like mine. Beam cutting across the wood paneling into the shadows where the ladder meets the wall. And there was nothing there. Empty boards, cold air, no movement. But the breathing didn't stop. Soft and steady, matching mine, until I realized I was holding my breath and the sound was still going. And in that moment my skin prickled cold because whatever it wasn't outside anymore. And it wasn't reading from the porch. It was in the cabin with me, breathing like it had been waiting, all along. By the time the third morning came, I was running on caffeine and nerves, the little orange rescue radio hissing on the shelf, while I stood barefoot on the porch with a mug of coffee gone cold, staring at the scratches carved into the cedar like they might rearrange themselves into scents if I watched long enough. The second set from yesterday was darker than the first, wood still raw around the edges, and every part of me wanted to sand them down, make them disappear. But something in my gut told me not to touch them, like erasing them might invite whatever, made them closer. So instead I walked the perimeter again, checking the bells, checking the leaves I'd scattered under the windows. Everything exactly where I'd left it, no prints, no signs, nothing except the memory of the voice last night, breathing against my ear, and the way the quiet seemed thicker than it had 2 days ago, like the air itself was listening. Around midday I followed the narrow deer path behind the cabin, the one Granger said looped down toward the river, but which I'd avoided until now, partly because I wanted answers and partly because sitting still inside those walls was starting to make my skin itch. And I'd barely gone 50 yards when I stopped dead because through the trees, maybe 200 feet off, a woman was standing perfectly still between two pines, her long dark hair hanging damp and straight, clothes pale, against the shadows, and though I couldn't make out her face, I knew she was looking directly at me. I called out, voice cracking more than I wanted, something stupid like hello, because I couldn't think of anything better. But she didn't answer, didn't move, didn't even tilt her head, and then the clouds shifted just enough for a shaft of sun to break through, lighting the space where she stood, and she was gone. No sound of movement, no crunch of leaves, no broken branches, just empty forest. And when I got there, chest pounding, there weren't any footprints, not even crushed needles where she should have been, like the ground had refused to remember her. Back at the cabin, I checked the porch again, the bells, the fishing line, ran my hands along the doorframe like maybe I'd feel something invisible left behind, but there was nothing. And I told myself maybe my brain was inventing shapes, stress, playing tricks, until I sat at the table and opened the notebook and saw a fresh page, paper smooth, my pen untouched. 3 words in neat black handwriting I didn't recognize. Don't stay past the third night. I slammed it shut like the cover could erase it and shoved it to the far side of the table, paced the room until my ribs hurt, but the warning sat there in my head like a splinter, the sentence pulsing with every hour sliding closer to dark. And I tried calling Granger on the rescue radio, cycling through channels until static filled the air. But channel 9 stayed dead. No voices, no help, nothing except my reflection in the black glass of the window, pale and jumpy, a stranger watching, himself. By sunset I had every lantern lit, the stove loaded heavy, the hatchet within reach, and I sat cross-legged on the loft mattress with my back against the wall, radio next to me, trying to listen past the thump of my own heart. And for a while, it was silent. No voices, no knocks, just the steady burn of the fire downstairs and the occasional groan of the old beams shifting in the cold. And I almost believed I'd make it through untouched until exactly 2:14 a.m., when it started again. Not the man's voice, not the woman's, but mine. My exact voice, the same tone, the same rhythm, reading last night's entry from start to finish like I was sitting at the table downstairs speaking into a recorder I didn't own. And my blood went ice cold, because there's fear when you think someone's outside, and there's another kind when you realize they're already inside. And I gripped the edge of the mattress, leaned over to look down into the main room where the notebook sat closed under the lantern glow, and the sound didn't match the scene. My voice filling the cabin while my mouth stayed clamped shut, The brass bells on the porch didn't ring, the fishing line wasn't touched, nothing triggered, but my voice kept reading, unbroken, steady, until it reached the last line I'd written about the scratches, and then it paused like whoever, or whatever, was using my voice knew what came next but wanted me to lean in closer, wanted me to need it. And before I could move, I heard the faintest creak from outside, soft and slow, weight settling on old boards, and I crawled forward far enough to see the bottom edge of the door in the lantern light, shadow spilling under it in a thin wedge that didn't belong, and I froze, holding my breath, waiting for the bells, waiting for something. But they stayed silent, useless, until the sound came again. Deliberate this time, one step, then another, closer, slower, like someone circling the porch, and the air in the cabin went cold enough to bite my teeth. Every sound amplified until the silence between creaks hurt, and then the reading voice, my voice, stopped mid-sentence, cut off clean like it had been muted, and the porch went dead quiet. No movement, no breathing, nothing. And I sat there with my fingers digging crescents into the mattress, sweat crawling down my spine despite the cold, until something tapped the glass of the loft window once, sharp and light, and when I whipped the flashlight beam up, the glass stared back empty. No hand, no shadow, no shape. And I thought maybe I'd imagined it until I lowered the light and saw it. Barely visible, almost an afterimage on the outside of the glass. 3 vertical streaks, perfectly straight, pale against the frost where fingertips had dragged downward, fresh enough the moisture still beaded where the warmth met the cold, and I stumbled back until I hit the far wall, panting, every muscle braced for whatever came next, but nothing did. No more taps, no more voices, just the sound of my pulse hammering in my ears and the knowledge that whoever was out there had found a way to climb, had stood inches from me while I lay awake pretending the walls were protection. And I don't know how long I sat like that, light locked on the window, waiting for a face I didn't want to see, until the first thin wash of gray touched the treetops and the frost bled back into water, streaks vanishing like they'd never been there at all. When I finally dared to go outside, the porch boards looked undisturbed, the fishing line unbroken, the bells silent, no footprints on the steps, no sign anyone had touched the cabin, and that was somehow worse than finding proof. Because now, I knew they could come close enough to breathe against the glass, close enough to copy my voice, close enough to leave warnings in my handwriting, and the thing gnawing at me wasn't just how they were doing it, but why. Because if they wanted me gone, they could have ended this the first night. But instead, they were watching, waiting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever's reading my words isn't just outside anymore. It's learning, practicing, getting ready for something I haven't written yet. By the 4th morning, the frost on the porch boards glittered under a pale sun that didn't warm anything. The scratches on the door frozen into sharp ridges I couldn't stop tracing with my eyes. 4 sets now, 3 lines each. Perfectly, straight, deliberate, carved deep like someone, or something, wanted to leave a countdown. And though my coffee had gone cold in my hand, I stood there staring until my breath turned to fog and vanished in the still air. I kept telling myself I'd leave before nightfall, pack the car, take the winding road back to town, pretend I'd never heard my own voice reading words I hadn't spoken, but the thought of driving away left me heavier than staying, like I'd stepped into a story that wasn't finished yet, and somewhere deep in my gut I knew leaving wouldn't save me. It would just follow, whatever it was. So instead, I grabbed the flashlight and decided to search the cabin properly, top to bottom, like I should have done the first night. I checked the loft, swept the beam along every seam of the rafters, no hidden crawl spaces, no loose panels. Then under the mattress, under the bed frame, around the stove where the walls met the floor, every inch of the place bare except for the dust of years and the faint outlines of things long gone, until I knelt to check the cupboard beneath the sink and found a small hatch I hadn't noticed before. Edges dark with age, handle smooth where fingertips had rubbed it thousands of times, and when I pulled it open, the smell hit first. Dry paper, mildew, and something faintly metallic like damp iron. And there, stacked neatly inside a wooden box with the lid half rotted, were 4 composition notebooks identical to mine. Same marbled covers, same black spines but warped from moisture, pages swollen and yellow at the edges. And though part of me wanted to slam the hatch shut and never touch them, My hands picked one up anyway, soft from years of damp, and flipped to the first page. The handwriting wasn't mine, but it was close enough to make my stomach twist. The loops wide and uneven. The sentences rushed like whoever wrote them didn't have time, and the first line read, "Day 1, moved into the cabin, road worse than I remembered." I froze, skin crawling, because that's exactly how I'd started my own first entry. Almost word for word, and as I turned the page, the dates moved forward, each entry slipping from cautious optimism into mounting panic, talking about scratches on the door, voices outside the window, bells that never rang, the feeling of being watched even in daylight, and the final page was covered in jagged scrawl pressed so hard into the paper it tore. "Don't answer. Don't write. Don't listen." I flipped through the second notebook, then the third, each one a different hand, different names signed on the inside cover, all of them describing the same things I'd been living, until the fourth notebook stopped abruptly halfway through. Mid-sentence, pen dragged into a smear like someone dropped it in a hurry, and the rest of the pages were blank. I stacked them carefully, slid them back into the box, shut the hatch, and sat there on the cold floor with my back against the counter, pulse slamming against my throat, trying to decide if this meant I was next or if I'd been next since the first night. When night fell, the cold came quicker than before, creeping into my joints despite the stove burning bright, and I sat at the table with every lantern lit, the notebook closed, the hatchet within reach, waiting for the voice, waiting for anything. But the cabin held its silence so long my eyelids grew heavy, until around 1 a.m., when I woke to the soft sound of a page turning in the dark, a quiet, deliberate shuffle like someone sitting at the table, and I froze, every muscle locked, ears straining, and then I heard it, a child's voice, high and trembling, reading slowly from one of the old notebooks I'd found beneath the sink. But the words came broken, tangled with soft, uneven breaths between sentences, and halfway through the second paragraph the voice cracked, small sobs muffled into the words like the child couldn't finish the story but had to, and something in my chest knotted so tight I could barely breathe, because I knew there shouldn't be any children here, no families, no neighbors for miles, and yet the voice sounded close, like it was sitting in the chair opposite mine, face bent over paper, tears dripping onto the page. I slid one hand across the quilt for the flashlight, gripped it tight, and eased down the ladder one rung at a time, careful not to make a sound. But the second my bare feet touched the floor, the crying stopped, clean, sudden, like a cut string, and the lanterns flickered once and held steady, the stove ticking softly, and the table was empty. No old notebooks, no child, nothing but my own notebook sitting untouched where I'd left it. I stood there trying to steady my breathing, telling myself to speak, to call out, but my throat locked like my body already knew better. And then, without warning, the bells on the porch jingled once, sharp and light, and I turned the flashlight toward the door so fast I nearly dropped it. Hard in my mouth, but the shadows under the frame stayed still. No footsteps, no sound, no knock. And when I finally forced myself forward and unlatched the chain, pulling the door open just enough to sweep the beam outside, the fishing line was intact, unbroken, bells swaying gently where the cold air had touched them, but nothing moved beyond the porch. No footprints, no figures, nothing but trees standing silent and infinite in the dark. I stepped back, closed the door, locked it again, pressed my forehead to the wood, and that's when I saw it. The notebook on the table, closed a moment ago, now lying open to a fresh blank page, words printed neatly in ink that was still glistening. Under the lantern light, a new warning written in a hand that wasn't mine, wasn't anyone's from the old journals either, precise and small. Don't let them know you hear them. My stomach dropped, cold crawling over my skin in a wave, because whoever or whatever was writing wasn't just reading anymore, it was responding. And the thing that hit me hardest, that lodged in the base of my skull and refused to let go, was that the ink hadn't smudged because it wasn't dry yet. And that meant whoever had written it had been inside, right here, while I'd been standing only feet away, watching shadows that never moved. By the fifth night, I'd stopped pretending the daylight made things better, stopped telling myself the scratches on the door or the voices in the dark were stress or sleep deprivation. because every time I tried to explain it away, something new made sure I couldn't. And as the sun bled out behind the trees that evening, I sat on the porch steps with the hatchet across my lap, watching the path, watching the woods, trying to decide if there was still a chance to leave before things crossed some invisible line. But the warning in my notebook kept repeating itself, in my head like a pulse. Don't let them know you hear them. And the idea of starting the car, driving through miles of dense forest, while whatever's been outside the cabin for 4 nights decided to finally close the distance, somehow felt worse than staying. The bells were still strung tight across the porch, the fishing line secure, lanterns filled and lit early, and I sat at the small pine table writing an entry I told myself I might not finish, words stuttering out in uneven bursts, when at exactly 2:03 a.m., a sound cut through the quiet so sharp it almost felt staged. 3 slow knocks on the door spaced evenly like punctuation, and I froze, pen halfway through a sentence, the fire popping once in the stove before going dead silent, and for a long moment I didn't breathe, didn't move, waiting for the bells to jingle, for the fishing line to snap, but neither made a sound. The knocks came again, this time 2 quick taps followed by 1 heavy thud, a strange rhythm like someone trying to teach me a code, and I don't know why I did it. Maybe because the silence after felt unbearable, maybe because curiosity always kills us first. But I reached over, tapped my knuckles against the table in the exact same rhythm, 3 beats back, and less than a second later, from the other side of the door, the exact same pattern answered, perfectly timed, perfectly mirrored, like whoever or whatever was out there had been waiting for me to play. I felt the blood drain from my face, my grip tightening on the pen, and I stood slowly, forcing myself 1 step toward the door at a time, until I was close enough to see the faint line of shadow beneath the frame. And when I raised my hand and knocked once, testing it soft and light, the sound came back instantly, softer than mine, like it was just on the other side, listening, matching, learning. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood and whispered, "Who's there?" Before my brain could stop me, and nothing answered, nothing except a faint shuffle, like bare feet on the porch boards, and then silence again, deep enough I could hear my heartbeat. And when I finally forced myself to unlock the chain and pull the door open just a crack, the cold night air hit me hard, empty clearing, no footprints on the frost, no figure in the beam of my flashlight, just trees layered black on black. But right there, placed perfectly in the center of the top step, was a notebook identical to mine, edges damp from dew, cover unmarked. And when I picked it up, my hands, shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I flipped it open to the first page and nearly collapsed because the words written there weren't old, weren't fragments from someone else's story. They were mine, my thoughts from the last half hour. Not the ones I'd written in my own notebook, but the ones I hadn't, the ones still stuck in my head, printed in neat black handwriting. I'm not sure I'll make it through tonight. What if they come inside? Don't let them know you hear them. Don't open the door. Every thought, every doubt laid bare on paper like someone had been inside my skull taking dictation. I dropped the notebook like it burned, backed up into the cabin, slammed the door, locked every latch twice, grabbed my own notebook from the table and flipped through it in frantic disbelief. But it was exactly as I'd left it, words ending, mid-sentence where I'd stopped, and my skin crawled with the realization that what was outside wasn't just reading what I wrote, it was writing what I hadn't yet, pulling my thoughts out like threads before I could decide to put them down. I grabbed the rescue radio, flipped to channel 9, hiss of static loud in the silence, called out for anyone at all, but nothing came back. Just the hollow white noise like the forest swallowed the signal whole, and I set the radio down, hands shaking so badly I knocked over the lantern, caught it at the last second before it crashed, and then I heard it. The knocks again, not on the door this time, but beneath the floorboards, a slow, deliberate pounding that matched the exact rhythm of my heartbeat, and I stumbled back, tripping, over the chair leg, flashlight beam swinging wild across the walls, catching shadows that didn't move, corners too dark despite every lantern burning. And the pounding stopped as suddenly as it started, silence hitting so hard it rang in my ears, and then, faint but unmistakable, I heard pages turning, slow and steady, and I turned the beam toward the table where both notebooks lay closed, undisturbed, yet the sound went on, each soft shuffle, dragging my breath shorter until I realized it wasn't coming from inside the cabin. It was above me in the loft. I swallowed hard, stepped backward until my spine touched the door, raised the flashlight toward the ladder, and the creaking stopped, replaced by a long inhale, sharp and quiet, like someone holding their breath to match mine. And I waited. Chest locked, hatchet grip so tight my knuckles hurt, but the loft stayed still, empty in the light. No figures, no movement, just shadows folding into shadows. I lowered the beam slowly, shaking, and when I looked back at the table, my notebook lay open to a blank page that hadn't been opened before, new words appearing one at a time in faint strokes like invisible hands were pressing the ink into the paper as I watched, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't move as the message finished itself. "We don't need you to write anymore. We already know." My knees gave out, body sliding down the doorframe until I hit the floor, breath coming in broken gasps, because for the first time since this started, I understood this wasn't about the notebooks at all. They didn't need my words, didn't need my permission. They weren't just outside anymore, weren't whispering through walls or playing games on the porch. They were inside where I couldn't shut them out. And every knock, every voice, every page had been less about haunting me than about teaching me, pulling me into some rhythm I hadn't realized I'd been following until it was too late. And when the lanterns flickered all at once and the bells on the porch jingled faintly in the dead air without any wind, I finally understood the thing I'd been trying not to. Whatever's been reading me every night isn't interested in watching anymore. It wants to see if I'll keep playing. By the 6th night, I stopped trying to write anything. Stopped touching the notebook entirely, left it closed on the table under the dim lantern light, like ignoring it might give me some control back. But around noon that day when I came back, inside after hauling firewood from the shed, I froze mid-step because the notebook wasn't where I'd left it. The cover open, pages fanned slightly, and when I got closer, my stomach dropped. The entry from the night before, the one I'd written in my own hand, wasn't mine anymore. Entire sentences had been rewritten, whole paragraphs rearranged. My words twisted into something colder, detached, clinical, describing things I hadn't seen, things I didn't know. And at the bottom of the page, in a smaller, sharper hand, I didn't recognize 4 new rules were written out like commands. 1. Keep writing. 2. Do not question the sequence. 3. Do not refuse interaction. 4. No one survives. The pen I'd left beside the notebook was clean. No ink smudges on my fingers, but the lines were fresh, black and wet enough that when I brushed one with my fingertip, it blurred beneath my skin. I grabbed the notebook, slammed it shut, shoved it under my arm, and started pulling every drawer, every cupboard, searching for cameras, wires, transmitters, anything to explain how my private thoughts weren't private anymore. But the cabin gave me nothing but splintered wood and dust. No answers. Just that low, constant weight pressing behind my eyes like being watched from inside my own skull. Sometime around 3 p.m., restless and wired from too much stale coffee, I found myself crawling under the bed frame in the loft where the boards met the wall, fingertips catching on the uneven grain, until one knuckle hit a recessed notch, and a panel gave way with a soft creak, revealing a narrow cavity packed with old files. Brittle pages curled and stuck from damp. I dragged them out carefully, spreading them across the floor, and the top folder was stamped in faded red block letters. Incident 1997, Site Echo. Inside were grainy black and white photographs of a cabin. This cabin, taken from angles only someone inside the woods would know. Pages of typed reports full of redacted lines, entire sentences blacked out except for fragments. 5 missing, 13 confirmed exposures, auditory anomalies persistent, cognitive breach, expanding beyond perimeter. My hands shook as I flipped further, finding a faded map of the surrounding forest marked with concentric rings. Dates scrawled next to each like someone tracking something spreading, and at the very bottom, one page clipped separately, handwritten, almost frantic. If you're reading this, you weren't supposed to stay past the 5th night. Stop responding. Stop listening. Don't follow the knocks. I shoved the files back into the cavity, slammed the panel shut, and sat on the floor staring at the hatch like sealing it could undo knowing any of it. But the warning kept looping in my head until sunset bled through the trees and the first shadows started climbing the walls of the cabin, slow and long like they were alive. By the time night fully swallowed the clearing, the lanterns were all lit. stove loaded heavy, bells set, fishing line tight, and I sat cross-legged on the mattress in the loft with the notebook on the floor beside me, refusing to touch it, but unable to take my eyes off it. And then, just after midnight, the first sound came. Not the knocks, not the voices, but the slow, soft rasp of paper turning on its own. My throat locked, breath held, as the notebook's cover shifted slightly. One page turning, then another. Faint scrapes like fingertips dragging against cheap paper, and then my hand moved before I could stop it, grabbing the lantern, leaning forward, watching as new words bled onto the blank page like ink soaking through from another reality. Sequence compromised. Adjusting narrative. My stomach knotted hard enough to make me dizzy because this wasn't just about them reading my diary anymore. They were editing it, rewriting it into something they wanted, and before I could process what that meant, the rescue radio on the shelf clicked on by itself, loud in the silence. Static first, then a voice beneath it. Flat, mechanical, not quite human. S-level breach detected. Initiating no S protocol. The words repeated twice, the hiss filling the cabin like wind in a cave, and then it cut off, dead air swallowing the sound. I stared at the radio, willing it to do something again, but the quiet was absolute, so I turned back to the notebook and saw that the rules on the last page had shifted while I wasn't watching, rearranged into one line, darker and heavier than before, pressed deep into the paper like it had been carved instead of written. No survivors. My chest went tight, pulse roaring in my ears, and in that moment the fire in the stove popped loud enough to make me jump, and that's when I heard it. Soft, measured, coming from behind me in the loft. A single footstep on bare wood, deliberate, close enough that the boards creaked beneath it. I spun with the lantern raised high, light slicing through the low ceiling beams, catching nothing but empty shadows. No figure, no movement. Just silence, stretching so long it roared. And I told myself I imagined it, that maybe the wood shifted, under the cold. But when I lowered the lantern, heart pounding hard enough to blur my vision, the air changed, denser, thicker, like something was standing right there, waiting. And then the notebook snapped shut on its own with a sharp crack that echoed in the loft, and I realized I wasn't imagining anything. I wasn't alone, and whatever had been outside these walls for 5 nights had finally come inside, close enough now that I could feel it breathing, patient, steady, like it already knew the rest of the story, and was just waiting for me to catch up. By the 7th night, the cold had sunk so deep into the cabin it felt alive, the wood groaning softly like it was breathing, and I'd stopped trying to make sense of what day it was, stopped pretending the sunlight meant safety, because the moment the first shadow touched the porch I could feel the air change, heavier, thicker, like something I couldn't see had crawled closer. The notebook sat on the table in front of me, closed, its cover damp with condensation, though the room was warm, and I didn't want to touch it, didn't even want to look at it. But every time I glanced away, the edges of my vision blurred, tugging me back toward it like the thing inside was waiting for permission. And then, without moving, without opening, a line appeared on the cover like it was burned into the marbled cardboard. Do not break sequence. My mouth went dry because I hadn't written that, hadn't opened the notebook since yesterday when the rules changed themselves and the last one screamed no survivors. But now I understood. Whatever this is, it isn't just watching me. It's writing me, and there's a difference. I stood pacing the small room, lantern light jumping wildly across the walls, stove popping once before falling quiet, and I pressed my fingers into my temples, whispering out loud just to hear my own voice. I'm not playing anymore, but the words felt wrong, leaving my throat like someone else had thought them first. I grabbed the radio, switched to channel 9, static spilling through the cabin, my finger frozen on the talk button, trying to decide if calling for help made me weak or stupid, when the static shifted suddenly, flattening into a steady hum, and then a man's voice came through, low, ragged, desperate. Ethan, you don't know me, but you need to listen. If you follow the sequence, you disappear. You have to break it. Now. I froze, knuckles white on the receiver, pulse pounding in my throat, and when I finally managed to stammer out, "Who is this?" the voice broke in over me, rushed and urgent. Name's Boone. Site Echo. I was here before. We thought the rules were instructions, but they're traps. They're making you predictable. My stomach lurched, cold blooming behind my ribs because Boone wasn't a name I knew, but I'd read it yesterday, hidden in the reports from the incident 1997. File under the loft. One of the missing 13 listed as presumed dead. I tried to speak, to ask where he was, but the static surged back, swallowing his words mid-sentence, leaving me alone with the hiss. And then, from the table behind me, the notebook opened itself. Slow and deliberate, pages fluttering without, wind stopping halfway through to reveal a message in heavy, wet ink. Sequence compromised. Correction required. I took a step back, chest tight, nails digging into my palms, and said out loud, shaking, No, I'm done letting you decide. And before I could stop myself, I grabbed the notebook and ripped out the page with the rewritten rules, the sound of tearing paper sharp and final. And the moment the last fiber snapped, the entire cabin responded. Every lantern flickered violently, shadows bending and stretching across the walls like they weren't tethered to anything real. The stove door slammed shut on its own. And the fishing bells outside all jingled at once, sharp and frantic. Though no wind moved through the trees, my breath came hard, ragged, as the room shivered under something I couldn't name. And then I heard it. Faint at first, layered and distant, the sound of my own voice repeating the words I'd written days ago. The exact phrases from my first entry, but multiplied, echoing over itself hundreds of times until the air vibrated with overlapping versions of me. Day 1, arrived around 5. Road worse than I remembered. Quiet feels like an animal in the room. I stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the table, knocking the lantern sideways, glass rattling but not breaking. And the voices grew louder, deeper, filling every inch of the cabin until it felt like being underwater, every syllable pounding in my skull, and I yelled over it without meaning to, "Stop!" And they did all at once, silence crashing down so hard it rang in my ears, and then the rescue radio clicked back on, Boone's voice cutting through the dead air like a blade. "They know you're resisting now. You don't have much time." My throat locked as I raised the receiver, desperate, but the static roared back before I could answer. And then, from somewhere deep in the woods, maybe 50 yards off, a sound rolled low and strange, almost metallic, a rumble too even to be thunder. And though the trees blocked my view, I could feel it, like the ground itself was responding to me, tearing the page. I backed toward the loft ladder, climbing fast, heart hammering, flashlight clutched tight. But as soon as I reached the mattress, I froze because the notebook wasn't on the table anymore. It was sitting on the bed, open, fresh words bleeding into the paper even as I watched. Sequence fractured, alternative path required, you will comply. My vision blurred, my head buzzing under the weight of the words, and I slammed the notebook shut, shoved it under the mattress, but the pressure in the air didn't lift. The entire cabin felt wrong now, like the space itself had stretched too thin, the walls leaning in and out with my breathing, shadows moving when I didn't, and I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help, because the sound was inside me, my own voice whispering from somewhere deeper than thought. "You shouldn't have done that." I snapped my head up, scanning the loft, breath shallow, and whispered back, "Get out of my head." But my voice came back to me instantly from the dark corner where the ladder met the wall. Exact, mirrored, mocking, like something else wearing me as a mask. I crawled backward until my shoulders hit the cold railing, clutching the flashlight so tight my fingers hurt. And then the last lantern on the table below went out, plunging the cabin into a damp, heavy blackness. Silence pressing against my skin, until from every direction at once, outside, above, behind, and inside my skull, the voices of 1,000 versions of me whispered the same 4 words in perfect unison. Do, not, break, sequence. By the 8th night, I'd stopped thinking of the cabin as a place I lived and started thinking of it as something alive. Something that breathed when I breathed and watched when I closed my eyes. And when the lanterns flickered one by one after, the voices of 1,000 versions of me whispered, do, not, break. Sequence the night before, I realized there wasn't anywhere left in this clearing that belonged to me anymore. The notebook lay closed on the mattress beside me where I'd shoved it hours ago. But the air was still dense with the weight of whatever was inside it, and every time I blinked I could swear the edges of the loft shifted, shadows stretching, and retracting like something pacing in places I couldn't see. Around 3 in the afternoon, after hours of listening to the walls breathe, I finally climbed down the ladder, set my boots on, and decided I was done reacting, done waiting for whatever this was to keep rewriting my life. And I started pulling at every loose board, every seam, crawling into corners like a trapped animal looking for a way out, until under the far wall behind the stove, my fingers hit something cold and metallic, a faint seam in the wood that didn't belong. And when I pried it open, the panel gave way, revealing a narrow shaft barely wide enough to squeeze through, air colder than outside pouring from it, carrying the faint electric tang of old machines. I grabbed the lantern, knelt low, slid inside feet first, boots scraping down rusted metal rungs until my hands touched concrete, and when I turned the lantern beam forward, my breath hitched. The shaft opened into a narrow chamber carved beneath. The cabin, walls lined with old conduit, shelves stacked with recording equipment decades out of date, magnetic reels, monitors dark but humming faintly like something sleeping, and in the center of the room, mounted into a steel frame bolted to the floor, a machine pulsed with a low blue light, cables feeding up through the ceiling into the cabin, above and etched into the frame in peeling white stencils. Control Note S4. My throat tightened because I'd seen that name before in the Incident 1997 files under the loft, scrawled next to a line blacked out so heavily I couldn't read it. And before I could think, I stepped closer, brushing dust from the surface, finding a panel with 5 switches labeled things I didn't understand. Sequence, mirror, sync, feedback, terminate, and above them, a single analog monitor flickered to life on its own as I reached out, lines of static resolving into grainy, black and white footage of the cabin from above, time-stamped real time, and there I was, sitting on the mattress in the loft, pale and still, lantern on the table burning steady. But when I glanced up, the mattress was empty. My lantern here with me, and my breath came faster because the me on the screen wasn't moving until suddenly, without warning, the image cut to another angle. Same loft, same timestamp, same me. But now I was lying flat, eyes wide, blood running from my nose, chest still, and a red counter burned into the bottom corner of the screen, counting down from Uri row 13 Gary in steady, relentless seconds. I stumbled back so hard I hit the frame, knocking dust loose, staring at the monitor like it could answer something, whispering to myself, "That's not me, that's not me." But the other Ethan blinked slowly, lips parting like he was trying to speak, and though there was no sound, the words formed perfectly on his mouth. "Leave." The counter dropped past ear 01247 and the screen went black, plunging the chamber into silence so deep I could hear the faint whine of the machine pulsing, low and steady, in sync with my heartbeat. I staggered backward, slammed into the ladder, scrambled up through the shaft and back into the cabin, chest heaving, slamming the panel shut behind me like it would hold anything back. But when I turned toward the table, the notebook was open, pages flipping wildly, though the air in the cabin was perfectly still, until it landed on a blank sheet, and in ink so dark it looked burned into the paper, a single line appeared. "Do not interfere with node S4. I backed toward the door, grabbed the hatchet with shaking hands, listening for bells outside that didn't sound, trying to steady my breathing when the rescue radio on the shelf clicked, hissed once, and Boone's voice cut in sharp, urgent. "Ethan, listen to me. They've mapped you. The counter isn't wrong. You're inside their playback loop. Everything you've done since the first night is being written ahead of you. They're testing responses. Don't give them the one they want." Before the signal tore into static, Boone's words shredded mid-sentence like something was cutting the feed on purpose. I spun toward the loft where the shadows deepened, flashlight beam slicing over the railing, and froze when I saw him. Me. The other Ethan, sitting on the edge of the mattress, elbows on his knees, head tilted low, shoulders rising and falling, slow like he was breathing with a rhythm I didn't own, and I croaked out, "Who are you?" But he didn't answer, didn't move, and then the lantern between us sputtered once, light dying for a half second, and when it came back, he was gone. Mattress indented where he'd been, cold settling into the quilt like someone had been sitting there for hours. I forced my legs to move, stumbling to the table, slamming the notebook shut. But the second the cover hit the pages, the bells outside screamed, all of them at once, loud enough to rattle the windows, metal clashing sharp into the night, and when I ran to the door, hand on the latch, I hesitated, knowing nothing good waited beyond it, but I had to see, had to know. And when I yanked it open, the clearing was empty. Frost untouched, trees silent, no footprints in the thin layer of snow except mine, but lying neatly on the top step, placed perfectly parallel to the edge, was a second notebook identical to mine, damp with condensation, and on the first page written in black ink as though it had been waiting for me. You won't stop it. My throat tightened, lungs burning, and I stumbled backward into the cabin, slamming the door, locking everything twice, sitting against the wall with the hatchet gripped tight, staring at the shadows creeping over the ceiling while somewhere, beneath the floorboards, deep in the machine I'd woken, the low hum of Node S4 began to rise, steady, growing louder with each second, in time with the red counter in my head that wouldn't stop ticking down. By the 9th night, I had stopped trusting the clock, stopped trusting the light, stopped trusting the sound of my own breath, because somewhere between the hum of Node S4 below the floorboards and the notebooks rewriting themselves on the table, time had started bending around me like heat-off asphalt, slippery and uneven, and no matter how many times I checked the hands on the cheap wall clock above the sink, I couldn't shake the sick certainty that I was already inside something, written before I ever got here. The red counter I saw on the monitor in the node room hadn't left my head, still ticking silently in the back of my skull like a second pulse. And when I tried to sleep, I kept waking from dreams where the countdown always hit 0 but never stopped, just reset again, over and over, like my body couldn't catch up to the story being told about it. Sometime around 11:30 p.m., I caught myself standing in the loft, staring at the notebook without realizing I'd moved, its cover closed but edges damp from condensation, like the thing was breathing. And when I finally grabbed it, fingers trembling, the pages inside weren't mine anymore. They were full of fragmented images, hand-drawn sketches of me sprawled dead in different ways, throat open on the porch, head twisted backward on the loft ladder, chest split on the floorboards, dozens of versions of me captured seconds after dying, some dated yesterday, some stamped with timestamps from hours that hadn't happened yet, and scrawled under one of the sketches in block black ink, and this one is next. I slammed the notebook shut, threw it across the room hard enough to knock over the lantern, light sputtering but holding, and the bells outside stayed silent, frozen in the cold, while under the floor the hum of Node S4 deepened, cycling lower until it vibrated in my ribs. I stumbled down the ladder, grabbed the rescue radio off the shelf, switched it on, static screaming in the quiet, and then Boone's voice tore through it, jagged, frantic, like he was running while he spoke. Ethan, they're trying to collapse you into one outcome. They want you to choose the death they've written. You have to fight it. Listen to me. If the bells ring at 3, you do not open the door, no matter what you hear, no matter who you think it is. Protocol 3 a.m. means they're almost inside. And then the signal cracked apart like something yanked it away mid-sentence, leaving me with nothing but the hiss. And I whispered into the receiver anyway. How do I stop it? But there was no answer. Just the steady rise and fall of my own breath until I realized the notebook was open again where it landed, pages flipping violently though there was no wind, until it stopped on a single blank sheet where 5 words appeared letter by letter as though pressed from underneath the paper. You can't stop it. My jaw locked, bile climbing my throat, and I stumbled backward into the table, catching myself, eyes burning as I stared at the words bleeding into the page like ink from a wound, and the walls around me creaked in slow succession, one after another, like the entire cabin was shifting forward an inch at a time, closing in. I grabbed the hatchet from the doorframe, flashlight trembling in my other hand, every instinct screaming to get out. But when I yanked the door open, the clearing outside wasn't the clearing anymore. The trees were wrong, too close, leaning, in strange, unnatural angles, their branches bending toward the cabin like ribs curling around a lung, and hanging from the lowest one, swaying slightly though the air was perfectly still, was a rope, with a loop tied neat at the end, and on the frost beneath it, black ink spelled out my name, perfectly written, not dripping, not smudged. Ethan. I slammed the door, shoved the latch, dragged the table in front of it for good measure, pulse hammering so hard my ears rang, and when I looked up at the loft, movement caught my eye. A silhouette stepping past the railing, pale and rigid, and for one dizzy second I thought it was the other Ethan again, the one I'd seen 2 nights ago sitting on the mattress. But when I raised the flashlight, the loft was empty, quilt smooth, no indentations, no one there, and then the bells outside screamed, all of them violently. Every one of the little brass shells crashing against each other like 100 hands were grabbing at the strings, and at the same time the stove snapped, door slamming shut, lanterns flickering violently in and out until the shadows on the walls started doubling, tripling, moving out of sync with my body, and I knew I was running out of time, because something was forcing the cabin into its chosen branch whether I fought it or not. I pressed myself against the far wall, every nerve locked, and then the rescue radio clicked again. Boone's voice weaker this time, distorted, fragments breaking apart through static. 13 loops, S-level collapse. If they reset you, you won't remember. Don't. Choose. Outcome. And then silence again, heavier than before. And somewhere deep under the floorboards, the hum of Node S4 peaked sharp and sudden, and the entire cabin shuddered once, hard enough to rattle dust from the rafters, and I froze because I knew what was coming before I checked the clock above the sink, the cheap white hands ticking steady toward midnight, faster than they should, skipping seconds like time was folding, and when I turned away counting my breaths, the sound started, a soft hollow ring from outside, the faintest tremor of brass colliding in a perfectly measured beat, distant but deliberate, and my throat dried instantly because I didn't need to check the time to know what it meant. Protocol 3 a.m. had begun and something was already at the door. When the first chime hit at exactly 3 a.m., soft but sharp, the kind of sound that lands deep inside your chest instead of your ears, I stopped breathing and just listened, waiting for the second ring that didn't come. The silence that followed, heavier than any I'd felt since the first night. And then something deep beneath the floorboards shifted with a low mechanical groan, the hum of Node S4 cycling up into a steady pulse that matched my heartbeat, faster with every second until the wood around me began to creak under its rhythm. I grabbed the hatchet, flashlight trembling in my hand, and whispered to myself, "Don't open the door, don't open the door." But the cabin had other plans because the locks on their own clicked one by one, bolts sliding into place without me touching them, the door sealing itself tight, and before I could process what was happening, I heard movement upstairs in the loft, soft and slow, footsteps crossing the boards exactly in time with my own breathing, and when I turned the beam up, my stomach dropped. He was standing there, me, an exact mirror of me down to the frayed cuff of my jacket and the way my jaw tensed when I clenched it, except his head tilted just slightly wrong, his neck bent, too far, and his lips moved without sound like he was reciting something silent, his eyes locked on me but empty, reflecting the lantern light in a way mine never could. I whispered, "What are you?" But my voice came back delayed, half a second late, out of sync, my own mouth forming the words in the loft after I'd already said them, and I understood in one jagged flash what Boone had been trying to warn me. Node S4 wasn't just reading me, it was writing me, creating alternatives, testing outcomes, splitting me into threads, and one of those threads had walked out of the notebook and into the cabin. I backed up toward the table, breathing shallow, and the notebook flipped open on its own, pages turning violently until they stopped on a fresh sheet where words bled into existence one by one. Follow him. My throat locked as the other, me stepped down the ladder, movement stiff but precise, hand sliding along the rung exactly as mine had earlier tonight, every sound perfectly matched. And I whispered no, but the notebook turned another page on its own, letters scratching across the paper without pen or hand, darker this time, pressing into the fibers so deep they almost tore. Sequence required. The bells outside jangled violently, strings snapping under strain, but the sound didn't come from the porch anymore. It came from inside the walls, metallic and hollow, dozens of small chimes crashing into each other until the air buzzed with it. And over that noise, the rescue radio clicked alive for the last time. Boone's voice ripped apart by static but urgent, panicked. shouting, "Ethan, listen. Node S4 is forcing collapse. It doesn't care which version of you survives. You have to make it choose wrong. Do something it hasn't written yet." And then the signal died mid-scream like someone cut the wire. I turned the flashlight back to the ladder, but the other me was gone, vanished, until the beam caught him standing in the far corner by the stove, head bowed, hands clasped, mumbling, words I couldn't hear. And when I took one slow step toward him, his head snapped up like it wasn't connected to anything, eyes wide and glassy, and I saw my own face twisted into something unfamiliar. And then, without warning, he lunged, not at me, but at the table, slamming his hand onto the notebook so hard the lantern rattled. And when he pulled it away, the words beneath his palm had changed. Project Echo, Subject 13. My breath stopped because I remembered seeing that phrase, buried in the Incident 1997 files, redacted heavily, but now it wasn't blacked out. It was stamped across my name, across the first date I arrived, the pages filling in with lines and lines of typed reports as if the notebook had been wired. To the node below, recounting every choice I'd made since stepping into this cabin, even the ones I thought I'd hidden, and at the bottom of the page, one sentence burned darker than the rest. Subject is now aware of duplication protocol. Final test commencing. I staggered back, nearly tripping over the chair leg, and the other me mirrored the movement perfectly. Same step, same stumble, until we both stopped at the same time, staring at each other in silence as the hum under. The floor rose into a high electric whine, and then the lights died, plunging the cabin into absolute blackness except for the faint blue glow seeping up through the cracks in the boards where Node S4 pulsed beneath us like a mechanical heartbeat. My chest tightened as the floor trembled faintly, and then the analog monitor hidden behind the false wall above the sink clicked on by itself, static filling the room before resolving into grainy footage of me and him, standing exactly where we stood, facing each other, time-stamped real-time, and under the image in flickering red letters. Final sequence initiated. One Ethan must remain. My grip tightened on the hatchet, sweat cold across my palms, and the other me tilted his head like a predator measuring distance, and for the first time since this started, I realized something I didn't want to know. He wasn't here to kill me. He was here to replace me. The moment the monitor above the sink flashed, final sequence initiated. One Ethan must remain. The other me moved first, sudden and silent, crossing the room with unnatural speed, his boots making no sound on the wood while mine thundered against the floor as I stumbled backward, raising the hatchet just in time to block his swing even though his hands were empty. The force of the impact shaking my bones like I'd hit steel instead of flesh, and for a fraction of a second I saw his face up close, saw my own features, stretched into something wrong, eyes too bright, pupils blown wide like they were swallowing light instead of reflecting it, lips parted as he breathed perfectly in sync with me, our chests rising and falling at the exact same rhythm as though the cabin itself had lined us up like mirrors. I swung first, the blade grazing his shoulder, splinters flying as he slammed me into the wall hard enough to rattle the lanterns, breath knocked out of me, stars bursting behind my eyes. And then he was gone, vanishing into the shadowed edge of the loft ladder like the dark itself had swallowed him. But before I could catch my breath, he dropped from above, colliding with me mid-turn, his weight driving me down, the hatchet skidding across the floor out of reach, and his hands closed around my throat with a strength that didn't belong to me, nails digging in, knuckles locked, and the only thought looping in my head wasn't survival but recognition. He wasn't trying to kill me, he was trying to become me. I slammed my knee up, twisting hard, breaking his grip just long enough to roll away and crawl toward the notebook lying open on the table, where pages turned violently, letters bleeding across the paper faster than I could read them, until one line burned through clear as fire. Termination required for continuation. My fingers brushed the hatchet, yanking it back into my grip, and when he lunged again, I swung blind, connecting this time with a crack that sent him sprawling across the floor, motionless, and for a moment, the silence in the cabin was absolute, except for my ragged breathing and the low constant hum of Node S4 vibrating through the boards beneath me. I staggered to my feet, chest heaving, staring at the still figure on the floor, my own face slack, pale, unmoving, and whispered hoarsely, "It's over." But the words felt hollow, wrong, like they belonged to someone else. And then the lanterns went out all at once, plunging the cabin into pitch-black silence, and the hum beneath the floor surged into a deep mechanical roar before cutting off sharp, absolute, leaving only the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then the world folded. No light, no sound, no weight. Just a sensation like being pulled backward through myself, my lungs collapsing inward while every memory I had shattered and rearranged in an instant. And when I opened my eyes, I was standing in the doorway of the cabin again, the air damp, gray light spilling through thin clouds overhead, my duffel bag in my left hand and the same battered composition notebook in the right. My car parked behind me exactly where it had been the first night. The porch untouched, cedar siding unscarred, no scratches on the door, no bells strung, no warnings carved into wood, and for half a second relief crashed over me like heat, until I opened the notebook and froze, because the first page wasn't blank. There were 12 entries already written in my handwriting, perfectly matching what I'd done over the last 8 nights, every detail down to the deer by the driveway and the words I'd crossed out, in frustration. And at the bottom of the 12th page, dated today, a line I hadn't written yet. Ethan takes 3 steps forward, sets the bag down and whispers, "This can't be happening." My throat went dry, bile rising as I stumbled backward, staring at the words until they blurred, and without meaning to, I took 3 steps forward, set the bag down and whispered, "This can't be happening." The sound of my own voice like a recording played back into my ears, and the panic hit like ice water in my veins as I flipped to the next blank page, knowing what I'd see before I saw it. Ethan realizes he cannot change anything. My hands trembled violently as I slammed the notebook shut and threw it across the room, breath ragged, chest tight. But even with my back turned, I heard the soft scrape of pages turning themselves, slow, deliberate, steady, until the cover lay open on the floor again, and the newest line appeared as I watched, written one careful letter at a time without pen or ink. "Resistance noted. Correction pending." My vision swam, knees threatening to give, and I staggered toward the sink for water when the rescue radio on the shelf crackled without warning, static erupting, and Boone's voice came through clearer than it ever had, calm but weighted, carrying something deeper than fear. "Ethan, now listen to me carefully. This isn't your first loop." I froze mid-step, every hair on my arms rising, the room spinning faintly as I reached for the radio, clutching it so tight my knuckles hurt, whispering back, "What do you mean?" "First loop." But Boone didn't answer directly. His voice, fractured by interference, repeating the same fragmented sentence 3 times, each one worse than the last. "We all thought we could change it. We all failed. They're not watching you, Ethan. They're writing you." Boone's words, "This isn't your first loop," kept tearing through my skull like static that wouldn't stop. And as I stood there clutching the radio in the dead silence of the cabin, lungs dragging in shallow, uneven breaths, the weight of it hit me all at once. Everything I'd done, every choice, every scream, every attempt to fight back had been written already, rehearsed, repeated, and no matter how hard I tried to change the story, it always curved back to this moment, standing here, waiting for instructions I never gave. And when the radio clicked again, Boone's voice came quieter now, distant, like he was speaking from miles beneath the earth. "Node S4 isn't just reading you, Ethan. It's rehearsing you. Project Echo wasn't about survival, it was about stability. They've been running you through scenarios until you choose what they want. But you're close. There's one way out." My throat tightened as I whispered into the receiver, "How?" But Boone didn't answer right away, just a faint hiss of static bleeding through until finally he said, low and final, "Destroy the node before it finishes writing you." I didn't remember crossing the room, didn't remember grabbing the lantern and the hatchet, but the next thing I knew, I was standing over the panel behind the stove, the one hiding the narrow shaft down into the node chamber. And when I pulled it open, the cold air hit me like stepping outside into something vast and endless, carrying that faint electric tang again, and I lowered myself into the tunnel, boots scraping down the metal rungs until I hit concrete. The node was louder now, a deep, resonant hum rolling up through my ribs like standing next to a jet engine, the pulsing blue core in the center throbbing faster than my heartbeat, cables twitching like veins under pressure, and I stepped closer, lantern trembling in my hand, until I saw the small analog monitor on the side of the machine flicker to life on its own, lines of white text scrolling over a black screen. Subject 13, sequence nearing completion, memory override, 93%. My breath caught in my throat as I gripped the edge of the console, whispering, "No, no, no." But before I could move, the notebook upstairs flipped open on its own with a snap I heard even down here, and the tiny mounted speaker next to the monitor clicked alive with my own voice, perfectly calm, narrating the next 30 seconds before I'd even thought them. Ethan steps closer to the node, raises the hatchet, hesitates, because he knows if he destroys it, he won't know who he is anymore. I staggered back, heart hammering, whispering, out loud, "I won't do it." But the speaker replied instantly in my voice, "He says he won't do it." My stomach lurched, bile rising, and I turned to the panel of switches Boone had mentioned before. Sequence, mirror, sync, feedback, terminate. And I gripped the terminate lever with both hands, yanking it down hard. The node screamed, a piercing, grinding sound like tearing metal. Lights on the console flickering violently, and for a moment the hum stuttered, like I'd broken something vital. But then the entire room went white hot, and the monitor shifted to a new line of text, this one pulsing with each word. "Override blocked, manual destruction required." My knees shook as I stumbled toward the machine, hatchet raised, ready to swing, when the lantern flickered and a shadow detached itself from the far wall, resolving into the other me again. But this time his movements weren't stiff or delayed. He was fluid, faster, his expression perfectly neutral, like all hesitation had been stripped away, and I knew instantly what he was. The finished version of me, the one the node had been writing toward this entire time, and as he stepped between me and the core, my voice came out of his mouth perfectly steady, calm in a way I hadn't sounded in days. "Destroying it kills you too." I gripped the hatchet tighter, sweat cold down my back, whispering, "Maybe that's the point." And then I swung, but the other me caught my wrist mid-swing, fingers locking hard, strength unnatural, and we grappled there in the dim blue light, the machine thrumming around us, our breaths crashing in sync, and I realized in that moment he wasn't trying to win. He was trying to stall me, to let the override finish, to let the story seal shut. With everything I had left, I twisted free, planted my boot against his chest and shoved him hard into the control frame, grabbing the exposed bundle of thick black cables at the node's base and swinging the hatchet down with a scream. I didn't. No was mine. The blade connected, sparks erupting as wires tore, the blue light stuttering violently, alarms blaring shrill and deafening. And for the first time since I'd found this place, the hum stopped completely. Silence crashed over me so fast it rang in my ears, the machine's glow dying to nothing, and I collapsed to my knees, lungs heaving, staring at the node as the last of its lights faded out. But the relief lasted only a second before the monitor blinked back on one final time, letters printing in steady black across the gray. Sequence failure. Initializing hard reset. My body locked as the world tilted sideways, a low vibration rising through the concrete floor until the entire chamber shook like an earthquake rolling up from the Earth's core. And before I could grab anything, everything inverted. The sound, the weight, the light, and I was falling through myself, lungs empty, vision smearing into white. And then I was standing on a porch under gray skies with damp air heavy in my lungs, my duffel bag in my hand, the cabin in front of me clean and untouched. No bells, no scratches, no blood, no node humming beneath my feet. But when I looked, down at the notebook resting on the porch rail, my throat closed because the cover wasn't mine, the marbled black and white replaced with a pale gray one stamped in thick black letters. Loop 37. My hands trembled as I picked it up, flipping it open to the first page, where only one sentence waited in perfect block handwriting. Begin. And from somewhere deep in the trees beyond the clearing, distant but coming closer, I heard the soft, deliberate sound of brass bells ringing, exactly 3 times.